Hi, my name is Gemma, Head of Candidate Experience at Tucker Stone, and welcome to the first discussion of our brand new series, A Time for Talent. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Katherine Ray. Katherine is the founder and director of Talentology. Talentology supports organisations have the best leaders, teams and culture to attract, develop and importantly, retain their people. They work with organisations across a wide range of sectors on different initiatives ranging from talent management, management and leadership development, DE&I, coaching and mentoring. Prior to founding Talentology, Katherine held several senior HR, L&D and talent management roles in dynamic and fast-paced FMCG and media organisations such as Diageo, Warner Brothers, Sky and Unilever. So to kick off today's discussion around retaining and sustaining talent, Katherine, I'd love to hear your thoughts and insights on the current landscape and how the talent environment is changing around us.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma. So the current landscape, I think it's safe to say that there is so much uncertainty out there at the moment and has been for nearly 3 years. We have a cost of living crisis. We have hybrid working that organisations are trying to figure out the best approach to. And also we have a rapidly diversifying workforce. So 3 big things, to name but a few. So I think we've really moved beyond the notion of VUCA and we're in a new space now where there's just a lot of uncertainty. And I think what's also really interesting is that we have gone from an environment of post-COVID growth where we saw a lot of organisations buying talent. And we're now moving towards an environment where, because there's a lot of economic uncertainty, we're seeing the need for organisations to maybe build more talent as opposed to just relying on buying talent. And many organisations are not being able to increase salaries. They have hiring freezes in some cases. There are budget cuts. There's cost cutting, so that might mean redundancies, and this sense of needing to do more with less. And I think what that means is that organisations are really having to ask themselves this question: what does their organisation need right now? Versus maybe a previous kind of approach, which was what's everyone else doing and let's kind of follow that. And I think it can be quite challenging because I think they need to still keep an eye on the external environment to know what's going on and how that might impact them. But there really is this sense of needing to focus on what they need. And I think just one last point on the current landscape, if we look at 2 of the most recently published pieces of external research from Gartner and Burson. Gartner published their report back end of last year, the top 5 priorities for HR leaders. The top 1 priority they called out was leader and management effectiveness. And then the Burson report that came out just a few weeks ago, HR predictions for 2023, said that the biggest trend for organisations is this need to redefine how they attract, retain, develop and employ their people. So I think if we take all of that into the mix, there's a lot going on in the current landscape.
There is a lot going on, and it's a complex situation to get your head around and also to get right. And I think that as we're moving from maybe a more external outlook, organisations are having to, as you say, take a more granular approach to becoming organisation specific, looking at their own. And when looking at their own and their own talent, I suppose it's also about defining what their talent is. What do they mean by talent?
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that is a really important question. It has been a really important question, but I think it's become even more important. When we use the word talent within organisations, what do we mean? And I think this is a question that organisations need to be able to answer very much now. And it will be different for different organisations depending on what their focus is and depending on how they've had to pivot and adjust and refocus in accordance with that kind of external landscape that we were just talking about. And And I think the other important question is, who is talent within your organisation? I think that's the second question that follows on from the what do we mean by talent? Is this the philosophy that everyone has talent? Is it those that have been identified and assessed as being high potential? Is it those with the critical skills that you need to either buy or build to be able to achieve your strategic goals and objectives? Is it your leaders, or is it your high performers? So who is talent? So I think this definition of who we are talking about is really important. And I think connected to that and connected to the current landscape is that I think organizations' approach to talent needs to be really agile. And I think it really needs to align to the needs of the organization in this ever-changing environment that we just spoke about. And I think also as well, there needs to be a greater link between talent acquisition and learning and development to get really clear on where and what the skills gaps are that exist within any organizations. So to identify what needs to be brought in and what needs to be built and developed.
And when you say, organisations need to be taking, that agile approach, and thinking about how they are supporting and retaining their own and their talent, where do you start with that? What key aspects are you to consider?
Yeah, and I think it's a question that no one really has the answer to. What do we mean by this agile approach? Because all the time we're moving into this need to change and adapt the way we've been doing things from previous years. But I think if we think about the agile approach to project management, we can apply some of the techniques from that, which is around continually reviewing actually what do we mean by talent, who is talent, and making sure that we are aligning what we are doing to those needs. So rather than setting out a kind of very long-term approach, which I think is almost impossible to do in this current day and age, is to kind of be more short-term focused about it and continually check back against what does the business need, and do we have the people to be able to deliver on what the business need is? And if we don't, what do we need to do about that? And I think that's a mix of buying and building. And I think, for organisations who are quite challenged at the moment in terms of perhaps hiring freezes or budget cuts or cost cutting, that's where this emphasis on retention and sustainability comes in. So taking more of a longer term approach to actually how can we keep the people and build and develop the people that we have, as opposed to just relying on that previous approach to just buying in when we need it.
And from the organisations that you work with and that you speak with, what are some organisations doing, or what can they do?
Yeah, so where do we start with retaining talent? So I think if we come back to the current landscape, there's so much that we can't control. So I think we need to really focus on the things that we can control. So controlling the controllables, let's use that phrase, to be able to retain and sustain. And I think we can't just talk about retain. I think it's retain and sustain, and coming back to this long-term view. So I think there's a couple of things where we can start. The first is looking at your data. And I think this is twofold. I think we can look at quantitative data. So what does your data tell you? Organizations have a lot of data at their fingertips. So what does that data tell you? But also I think there's a qualitative aspect to that, which is listening and feedback. So what are your people telling you? Why are people not happy? Why are people leaving? And then once you've got that information, really focusing on the key things that are coming out of that data and focusing on those things that are going to make the biggest difference. I think there's also a perspective of evolving things versus resolving things. So again, taking this longer term view, evolving initiatives and programs versus implementing them more like a tick box exercise. So thinking about things as a long-term investment and wrapping them all up together into things that are going to give you sustainability down the line. I think we also, as a function, as a profession, HR need to maybe try and be more creative and think about new and different ways to engage and motivate people. And I think there's also things that leaders and managers can do to support their people in uncertain times.
I think there's also a piece around it's like the three-dimensional relationship now, and with the individual, the manager, and the senior leadership team, how do those three connect and build a strong relationship that ultimately makes people want to stay and evolve and develop with the organisation. And I think you've summed up perfectly the different aspects that organisations can consider, how they need to be more, everybody is saying it, human-centric, and take a more creative and personal approach.
And I think leader and management effectiveness is going to be really important. And I think if I look at what other organisations are doing, and if I look at who I work with, what some of the things are that they're focusing on, I think that is definitely really important. And you mentioned moving towards this more human-centric approach. And I think importantly, equipping current and future leaders with the essential tools that they need to be able to manage and lead in this new era of work, because we are in a new era of work. And I think coupled with that comes culture. So perhaps the need to redesign or repurpose the organisational culture that is going to create the environment to attract and retain people. And not just to be able to attract and retain, but to create a culture that speaks to the kind of sentiment of Simon Sinek's work, that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So a more purpose kind of driven culture that has strong values, but equally is very purpose driven in terms of its impact that it has on the world. And I think you can't do one without the other, because leadership and culture are inseparably linked. And I think there's a couple of other things that I'll just mention. I think there's something around building and maintaining trust. I'm seeing that a lot. A lot of teams are working on, how do they build trust when new people join, but also how do they maintain trust as a means to retain people? Because we know from a lot of research that trust is really important. And that connects with this phrase that we've heard talked about, quiet quitting, that came out last year. So how do we ensure that we have those healthy team environments where people aren't quite quitting? And then I think there's a focus on productivity. So this isn't about making people work harder. This is about how do we make sure people are set up to be as productive as they can be, and making work as simple as possible. And last but not least, probably one of the areas that I'm most passionate about is how do we capitalise on collective intelligence? So I'm seeing a lot of interest in mentoring programmes, for example, as a means to connect, get people to collaborate and co-create. So I'm seeing reciprocal mentoring and reverse mentoring being used to address some of the big themes like DE&I and workplace culture. I'm seeing developmental mentoring being used to support career development. And I think in the future, and they're probably not too far ahead, distant future, there's probably going to be a greater need for peer mentoring to really facilitate that knowledge sharing and learning across organisations. So I think we can safely say that 2023 is going to be the year that organisations need to really know and grow their people like never before.
That's been brilliant. I mean, it's been so insightful, really valuable. And thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversations.
Great, me too. Thanks, Gemma.